It's okay. I will go on while I'm still fixing. So we will explore his music by highlighting his unique genre of piano miniature, which he called fairy tale or сказка in Russian. These short but powerful pieces were filled with imagination and poetry and quiet sense of national identity. But to understand his musical voice, we will need to step briefly into his personal life and explore his background, his journey across the countries, and the emotional state he carried with him. Because all of this shaped the way he composed, and understanding it will help us hear his music in a more meaningful way. On the background, you can hear his composition. Or maybe not. Not today. Can we go to the next slide? Николай Медтнер was born into the, now the next slide. So he was born into the world undergoing rapid transformation. The end of the 19th century saw an astonishing acceleration of change. We had revolutions, world wars, new technologies like airplanes, the radio, motion pictures. The borders were shifting, and so were the nations of people and individuals. And their identities were shifting as well. So in classical music, it was the age of nationalism, when composers sought to express the soul of their countries and cultures through sound. But while many did so by using the folk tunes or national themes, Nikolai Medtner chose a different path. He expressed it in a more internal and intimate way. And the contradictions of the surrounding world aroused in him the desire to save the traditions of the previous time of classical art from the developments of the 20th century. So, the criticism of modernism was one of his leitmotifs that we could see in his letters throughout his life. Here in London, I almost suffocate from loneliness and my irrepressible protest against the musty half-century fashion of clowning in art in general and in music in particular. Out of fear of imitating the examples of the great eternal art, contemporaries have fallen into the imitation of art, that is, into playing art, as children play daddies and moms. As a wise person, he perpetually interested and curious in many things. He was constantly reflecting on his creative aura for its relevance. He saw himself as a humble person, humble artist, defending the foundations of classical art through the lens of his conservatism. And he saw himself as a man 100 years late to be born. Medtner's rejection of contemporary trends in music inevitably led both to creative loneliness and a particular lack of interest and understanding from his contemporaries and succeeding generations, understanding of his music. So it is only now that his music is being revived gradually and probably recognized. Nikolai Medtner was born in Moscow in 1880 into the culturally rich family. His parents were from Sweden and Germany, but they had long been assimilated into the Russian society. And Russia wasn't just their address, it was their homeland at this point. His mother from the renowned Kebek family, musical family, was a singer. His father was a poet and a philosopher. His siblings were also like a philosopher, a violinist, and a conductor. And Medtners overall were very immersed in the intellectual and artistic life of their time. So since the early age, Medtner was immersed into that culture and he absorbed a lot from it. Medtner studied at the Moscow Conservatory and eventually he taught there. He was an artist who could compose and perform, and he could make the listeners be part of this musical journey. He didn't belong to any one school or style, and it makes him, paradoxically, one of the most authentically national Russian composers of his time. The Second World War brought challenges to the entire Medtner family. When the composer was exempted from the conscription, some people who considered themselves patriots talked about his German origins. And in 1921, Medtner and his wife emigrated to Germany. Now we can play this. Yes, we can play this.
Ящика в высокий товарный вагон, совершенно темный, грязный, прокуренный. Осенью 1920 года мы временно переехали в Москву. 23 часа ушло на то, чтобы проехать 106 километров до Москвы, сидя на полу среди мешков. Николай Карлович не спускал со своих колен папку с забытыми мотивами. Уехать из России навсегда никогда не было его намерения. О своем отъезде он говорил так: может быть, это и нехорошо, но меня заботит моя музыкальная судьба. Уезжая, я совсем не о себе забочусь. Я увожу свою музыкальную работу. Ненадолго, только на время. Россия всегда была и навсегда осталась родиной Николая Карловича.
In Germany, however, interest in his music was negligible, and concert offers were non-existent, almost non-existent. So another great Russian composer, Sergei Rachmaninoff, who actually after the revolution happened, emigrated to the United States, he helped Medtner throughout his life, and often quietly, so Medtner didn't know about it. And once he organized for him a big concert tour in the United States in 1924-25, and it helped Medtner immensely. After he came back to Europe again, he settled in Paris, where unfortunately the interest in his music was also very little, as it was in Germany. In February of 1927, Nikolai Medtner gave a big and successful tour in Russia for the last time, because unfortunately after that time he was denied permanently the visa to visit Russia. So from then on, his country existed for him only in dreams and in his music. In this sense, his self-identified piano genre fairy tale became his homeland. They express what it means to be connected to their culture, to his culture. And this brings us to a broader perspective, that the true national music often emerges from an artist's inner dialogue with their own heritage and culture. And I think this is particularly relevant when we consider Tatar classical music. Like Medtner's work, Tatar classical music exists at the crossroads of the memory and reinvention. Rooted in rich vocal tradition and pentatonic melodies and poetic storytelling, Tatar classical music doesn't merely preserve tradition. It translates it into new forms, like art songs or instrumental compositions, orchestral works. And these modern expressions retain the spirit of Tatar folklore, but in a more composed and refined musical language. From 1935 until his passing, 1951, Medtner permanently resided in England. The English loved him. They respected him, honored Medtner by making him an honorary member of the Royal Academy of Music. They even considered him as English composer. But Medtner remained profoundly elsewhere, and his wife Anna captured it best when she said, his soul involuntarily sang songs in its native spirit. And this single line tells us more than volumes of biography, because it shows us the very center of Medtner's musical identity. While many composers built their national style on outward references, like Tatar folklore, the folk melodies and historic themes, Medtner's connection to homeland ran deeper. His music was not nationalistic in a declarative sense, but it spoke the language of home in every phrase. The main aspects of of Medtner's aesthetic concept are based on the classical romantic heritage and the rejection of unjustified use of spectacular artistic means, which destroy the musical meaning in composer's opinion. The rejection of spectacle and superficial expressiveness doesn't diminish the sonic thought, which has an incredible energetic power in it. Medtner's compositional style has a synthesis of Russian classical school and the German romantic tradition. So what is the romantic tradition in classical music? There are several distinguished points. And the first one is the love of concise or expansive forms and new genres. So concise forms such as miniatures and fairy tales fall into that category. They were very common among romantic composers. Another characteristic of romanticism is the manifestation of individualism, or self-knowledge through reflection. Moments of poignant tension are found most often in the emotionally colored content of his fairy tales. These are not picturesque tales, nor are they stories illustrating someone else's adventures. They are fairy tales about one's own experiences, the conflicts of one's inner life. Another feature is program music, when the specific story is attached to the piece. Medtner had almost no program music in his standard understanding and standard form because he was against it. He rarely revealed secrets of his musical ideas even to his own family members. But Medtner usually gave program poetic remarks that suggest the idea but don't reveal it completely, thereby inviting the listeners into the process and giving them space to make their own conclusions. Occasionally he did give some of the titles to his work. For example, one of the fairy tales is called King Lear from Shakespeare. He did not publish these titles, but he always would list them in his own copy. That's why we know about their existence. For the mentioned King Lear fairy tale, he only used one short epigraph. Blow, wind, be angry till your cheeks burst, King Lear in the field. And I would like us to hear an excerpt from this fairy tale, and if you feel comfortable, you can just relax, sit back, and close your eyes and just take the music in. So did the epigraph help you to grasp on what you would hear? Like blow, wind, be angry till your cheeks burst? Yeah. So that was his point. Sometimes Medtner commented on some of his fairy tales more extensively, giving his explanations in the form of short remarks. For example, the fairy tale of 34 number 3 is called The Leshi, but a kind and pitiful one. Leshi is something similar to Shurale from our Tatar folklore, the creature of the forest. Another tale, opus 20 number 2, is called Ominous Bells or Campanella, a a song or fairy tale of a bell, but not about the bell. Finally, Medtner's deep interest in literature reflects a broader romantic tradition of connecting music with other art forms. The influence of both Russian and European writers helped shape his artistic voice. He was very fond of, for example, Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, or he admired poets such as Pushkin, Lermontov, Tuchev, Goethe, and Heine. And some of his vocal works were set on the poetry of these poets. This literary sensibility also shaped his fairy tales, I think, where narrative and inner world take the center stage. Medtner was not only a composer but also a thinker. He was author of 2 books on musical art. The influences of the Romantic period and the beginning of the 20th century shaped a special mentality of art people and their attraction to fairy tale imagery, magic, and fantasy. We could see it in the art of Hector Berlioz in his fantastic overture, or Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, Scheherazade, or the first Tatar national ballet by Farid Firulin, Shurale. And it is only natural that the fairy tale as a concentrated expression of poetic fiction and fantasy was one of Medtner's favorite genres. So what is the fairy tale? The fairy tale is an integral part of the formation of the person anywhere in the world. It's not just fiction, it's a vessel of truth. And it helps us to shape the inner world and emotional identity. Medtner's fairy tale is not a quotation from a folk tale, it is an actual tale. And he didn't cite folk melodies directly, but he created new music that sounded as if it had always been in the Russian soul. Medtner typically grouped his fairy tales into cycles. So he overall composed 38 fairy tales, and each cycle has 2 to 6 fairy tales in it. The most well-known of these 7 cycles were composed while he was still in Russia, and the 3 others he composed when he was abroad. And these fairy tales, they have a distinctive, national theme in it. The thematic content of the fairy tale is very diverse. They reveal folk images like Cinderella and Ivan the Fool, folk legends or heroic themes like March of the Paladin or the Poor Knight, fairy tale characters like Leshy, or figures from the world literature like Ophelia's song or King Lear, as we heard before. The imagery in Medtner's fairy tale can be roughly grouped into a few different types. Lyrical and intimate. These pieces feel very personal, they're very expressive, and usually build on a singing-like quality. Another ones are light and playful, and there are also fairy tales that are more dramatic and passionate, again, as a King Lear, for example. But as Yelena Dolinskaya, the most important biographer of Nikolai Medtner, points out, these categories are only approximate, because in many of his works the moods shift and blend, so a lyrical passage may suddenly become a dance, or a bold style may give way to something more melodic and singing-like. At the very end of his life, something truly remarkable happened, almost like a moment from one of his fairy tales. While living a quiet and reclusive life in London, he suddenly received an offer from a faraway admirer, Badiya, the Maharaja of Mysore in India. Although the two never met in person, Maharaja became one of the greatest Medtner's patrons. He financed the series of Medtner's recordings of all his pieces to share them with the wider world. And in gratitude, Medtner dedicated his 3rd piano concerto to Maharaja. Although Medtner's health prevented him from fully completing the project, we now have access to his own recordings, and this is a rare and priceless gift to music history. And I would like for us to hear the excerpt of him playing the Leshy fairy tale. stand as a powerful example of what national music can be, and that nationalism in music is not about imitation, but about authentic emotional continuity. Tatar composers such as Salih Sadashev, Rustem Yahin, Almas Manasipov explored ways to bring the essence of Tatar song and narrative into contemporary musical forms. And their works don't just quote folk tunes, they breathe in the Tatar identity into the music, the same way as Medtner's music breathed in the Russian spirit into his fairy tales. And this connection between Medtner and Tatar classical music points us toward a larger truth. Nationalism in music is not always loud. It's often quiet and internal and poetic. It exists not in how loudly one asserts their culture, but in how deeply one listens to it and how meaningfully one transforms it. In the end, Medtner's fairy tales, like many works of Tatar composers, they do more than entertain. They preserve a worldview, a set of values, and a memory of homeland. Sometimes idolized, sometimes mourned, but always loved. Medtner strove to embody in his fairy tales something more than a whimsical fantasy. Each fairy tale is a creative workshop of the composer, where time stands still and music flows. Thank you. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.
I just have a comment. I'm just so impressed with how you finished it with nationalism being quiet and poetic. I just want to think about it and really
Reflect.
Because it sounds so prominent. Because we, for some reason, think that nationalism should be all over the place, screaming and raising flags or something like that. But I never thought that it can be actually. I mean, of course, it's internal as well, but poetic. Well, maybe we can do something with it. The young generation, can we present nationalism in the poetic version of it? And maybe it's actually help, as Professor Daniel Ross mentions, to bring awareness to the history as well. Let's look at it poetic. So beautiful.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for such a beautiful comment. Yes.
I don't know if you mentioned this, but why wasn't he allowed to go back to Russia?
It was a very difficult time at that time in Russia. There were revolutions happening, and the whole administration political system was breaking, and some new things were coming in. He was also of a German-Swedish origin. That was also quite a problem in the administration. So for some reason they just denied permanently his visa, so he couldn't come back.
I don't have a question. I just want to, can you speak about your spectacle? I know that Tatar spectacles, they are also based on Tatar creativity.
Yeah. So I was trying to experiment how to bring Tatar music into American society, and I came up with the idea. I'm sure it's not new. Maybe it's new in my generation or here in America. So I combined the fairy tale narrative with the classical Tatar music, and I did this concert intertwining these both forms of art, so people could easily immerse themselves into the music, because I want them to know about the music and the culture itself. And I've decided to do it as a more rounded experience. I would also put an exhibition of Tatar items, and then I would do the QR code so people can actually, if they're interested, read more about our culture and explore it more. And recently, with the Peabody Conservatory and Johns Hopkins University, we created a movie based on that concert. And now I'm thinking, if you know any people who can animate, please let me know, because I'm looking for someone who can do that. So, because my idea is to attract kids into that as well, and it's not so easy to do to sit them and we're now gonna listen to Tatar classical music for 40 minutes. So I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting and implement animation and puppeteers and music and talk more about our culture, so more and more people know where we are from, what our roots are. And I think it could be something interesting. And if you have any ideas how I can make it better, please share. I will gladly. Oh, that's awesome. Okay. See, that's why I like these events.